Father Michael Orsi. I'm your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which brings you the big G for the gospel of Jesus Christ and little g, all the good things that people do to put that gospel of life into action. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, there are certain issues that Father O is very fond of discussing because they're very important issues. Today, we have a gentleman. He is an attorney. His name is Alexander Bumbu, and you might be saying, Bumbu, what kind of a name is that? Well, it's a Romanian name. You know, I think that's where, didn't Dracula come from there? Romania? Alexander?
Well, yes, Vlad Tzepes was the real life prince on which Vlad Dracula was loosely based, so yes.
His parents come here, and they bring him to church one day, and he hears a preacher talking about religious freedom, correct?
Yes, Father.
Okay, so he's talking about religious freedom, and at a young age, Alexander says, that's the Holy Spirit speaking to me. Now, Alexander, you work for an organization called the Pacific Justice Institute, and it deals with issues like religious freedom, pro-life issues, and parental rights issues. Now, you seem to be like perfectly placed. But I want to know what that preacher said, what the Holy Spirit said to say to Alexander, yes, this is what I want to do with my life.
Sure. So when I was a junior in high school, about 10 years ago now, we had a guest speaker at our church one Sunday night. And this guest speaker was a litigator. And he litigated freedom of religion cases, freedom of speech cases, and pro-life cases. And so he gave a presentation on the cases that he was working on. And at that time, I had actually wanted to become an anesthesiologist. I liked the money that they made, and I figured I might as well go into it for the money. And I was planning on going to medical school and so forth, but I never really liked the STEM subjects. I'd always liked history, geography, the social studies, right? And I think that's how the Lord prepared me for what I was going to hear that Sunday night. And when I was listening that Sunday night, I was like, you know what, there's a need for these types of people. I also felt like a fire was kindling inside me. And I said, maybe being an anesthesiologist is not what the Lord wants me to do.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you'd spend your whole life putting people to sleep. I mean, you're doing much more exciting work now. You see, ladies and gentlemen, how that Holy Spirit works. I mean, he's at a prayer meeting, he's at some youth meeting, parents take him to church, he goes out some night, the guest speaker, and what is he talking about? These important issues, pro-life issues, religious freedom issues, parental rights issues. So then he goes off to college and then he goes to law school. Very fine law school. It's at George Mason University, and it's the Antonin Scalia School of Law. So anything named after the great Antonin Scalia has to be very, very good. And so, voila, the proof. We have Alexander Bumbu comes out of that school, and then he gets involved with the Pacific Justice Institute. Now, tell us about the Pacific Justice Institute. Well, how did this happen? Where is it?
Sure. So the Pacific Justice Institute is a nonprofit law firm that specializes in defending religious liberty, the right to life, and parental rights, as you mentioned before. It was founded in 1997, and we have offices right now in 17 states across the country. We have over 50 cases in ongoing litigation, and we will take not just the cases that are likely to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, but we have a unique commitment to taking all the cases that fall within our mission.
Wow, that's a lot of cases, because like the issues that I was just describing, I mean, there's litigation all over the country about these issues, including on the federal level. So you folks, how many lawyers do you have working for you?
I believe we have 21 at my last count, spread over 17 offices throughout the country. I am their one attorney here in Florida.
Wow, you've got your hands full. You know, folks, I've been in touch with Alexander a number of times, especially referring people to him because, well, you heard about the vaccine mandates, correct? Now, let me tell you something, folks. You know, for full disclosure, I am fully vaccinated. Why? Well, I had to do an algorithm. First of all, I am over 70 years old. I know I don't look it, but I am, all right? Number 2, I am a diabetic. Number 3, I'm at the hospital quite often, and I'm in large crowds of people quite often. So for me, I said, well, you know, it makes sense. And, you know, a lot of times people say, well, you know, you don't know the long-term effects of these vaccines. Well, let me tell you something. What could the long-term be for me? I mean, but for some people, there could be long-term effects, number one. Some people might have conscience reasons why they don't want to be vaccinated, and some people might have medical reasons, or they might have religious reasons why they don't want to be vaccinated. And so I send a lot of these folks over to Alexander to help them out. So Alexander, I mean, I think we'd probably take a whole show or two talking about these exemptions because of the mandates, okay? So let's talk first about, and I know you work with this because people I send over to you say that you're just a great guy and it's great to work with you. Talk about, first of all, the religious exemptions. What does this mean and how do you help people to obtain one?
Sure. So I'll start off with the vaccine mandates coming from employers. So prior to the federal government's vaccine mandates as they started rolling out at the end of last year, we were dealing mostly with, and we still are dealing mostly with employers' vaccine mandates, right? And under a federal law called Title VII, the employer must provide reasonable religious and medical accommodations to these mandates, unless providing an accommodation would constitute an undue hardship for the employer. But for all intents and purposes, they have to provide religious accommodations and medical. Now, we've had a lot of people reach out to us about getting religious accommodations, and we only do religious accommodations. And so what we do when they reach out to us is normally we will write a letter to the employer. The employer either has not given a religious accommodation to this person, or they have a religious accommodation, but in name only. And in the sense that they have a religious accommodation on paper, but they're refusing all of the applications for religious accommodations as they come through the door. So it's in name only, right? It's pro forma. So what we will do is that we will write a letter to the employer stating that they are wrong under Title VII or even possibly a parallel state law like we have here in Florida. And we tell them that our client has clearly explained their religious beliefs, their religious objections to the vaccine mandate in their application for religious accommodation, and so that the employer has to grant it in order to remain compliant with federal and or state law. And in my experience, most of the employers have generally complied. They've reneged, they've gone back, they've taken back the adverse employment actions they've taken against people, against their employees. I haven't had to litigate any one of these cases yet, which is good. Some of my colleagues have, but we've been pretty good here in Florida. Also, it really helps that we have Governor DeSantis here and the things that he's been doing.
So the folks that I've been sending your way, for the most part, you know, when you provide them with this letter, they have been successful in their appeal for a religious exemption. Now, is it because we are in Florida and the governor of the state is amenable to that. But you mentioned other states that it's not been so easy. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, California is one of the hardest ones. I personally don't have experience in California because I'm not licensed in California, but some of my colleagues work in California. So California is hard. New York is hard. California and New York mostly. Oh, and also Illinois. So those are the harder ones. Fortunately, here in Florida, I haven't experienced pushback from employers. So they've just kind of caved in, or even one time there was even a case where the employer decided that it was going to suspend its vaccine mandate for everybody. So because I think they see the writing on the wall, and they see that even though Title VII is a federal issue, it's a federal law, they also have pressure coming from the DeSantis administration at the state level. So we've been pretty good here.
But what about, we talk about a religious accommodation, okay? Could you give us some idea of what constitutes a religious accommodation? Let me just talk to the audience about this. A lot of people are concerned about, especially Catholic people, I'm not saying that non-Catholics aren't, but a lot of Catholic people are afraid that the vaccines are made using aborted fetal tissue. Now, a couple of the companies say we used it during the experimental stage, but it's not in the final product. A couple of other companies say it is in the final product. When the Vatican said it is too remote to have a religious exemption, remote meaning that these germ cell lines were developed in 1973. In other words, it's too far back to have a formal connection with the immorality of using the vaccine. So the Vatican said there is no moral issue because it's too far in the past. Bishops around the country had different opinions. Some bishops say we're going to give a religious exemption because the use of illegal aborted fetal tissue was used. Other bishops said we're not going to do that because the Vatican says it's too remote. So suppose you have somebody here in Florida or elsewhere that says, no, for me, this is a religious issue. I feel very strongly about this. Well, this is when somebody like Alexander, a knight in white armor, comes on the scene. And tell us now, how do you frame this for people when some of the different denominations have different opinions and some denominations have no opinion at all?
Well, I would like to kind of go through how we guide people on how to write an application for a religious accommodation. So, in addition to writing a letter to their employers, we can also help them write their own letters for religious accommodation. We won't write it for them, but we have guidelines that will lay out what they should be thinking about, really. And what they should include or not include in their letters. So, for example, in order to have a religious accommodation, the first thing is that the religious belief must be religious. It cannot be something that is a political belief, or it's a choice that you're making because of your health, or it has to be a genuinely religious belief, which means it really should be based in your holy text. It should be based in scripture. And one of those religious beliefs, one of those strongest ones, one of the more successful ones, is the belief that the vaccines are derived from aborted fetal cell tissue. And so the belief has to be sincere, and it has to show, although an employer cannot deny your accommodation just on the basis that the employer thinks your belief is crazy or something, or even if the employer thinks it's irrational, on that basis alone, they cannot deny the application. However, what they can do is that they can test and see how sincere that belief is. Is it a long-standing belief? Have you been consistent in your belief and your other religious beliefs throughout your life? They can ask those questions. They want to know, have you had this belief? How sincere is this belief, or is it something that you just decided to become religious right now?
Mm-hmm.
So they can do that. There is in legalese, we call this a burden shifting scheme under Title VII, which means, what does that mean? Under Title VII, the employee who's asking for the accommodation, they have the initial burden of making a prima facie case that they have a religious objection to taking the vaccine. So they have to make a case on its face that they have this objection. And that's a low burden. That's a low burden to meet. And then once the employee meets that burden, the employer then has the burden of engaging in an interactive process with the employee to find a reasonable accommodation.
As you can imagine, producing this wonderful program, Action for Life, it costs a great deal of money. We're going to need your help. So if you would like to donate to keep this good news program on the air, please go to your computer, your cell phone, actionforlife.net. Thought for the day. Our country is going through a tumultuous time. Many people are questioning the very foundations upon which this country has been built. One of the foundations that people are often forgetting is that this country was built on biblical principles, on justice and righteousness, and also upon charity. So much so that our founders had engraved on top of the rotunda of our Capitol in Washington the words of the prophet Micah. Remember, man, do what is right, love justice, and walk humbly with your God. To talk about a reasonable accommodation, I go to my employer and I say, look, here's a letter. It states my religious beliefs. I've always practiced this in my whole life. I'm sincere about this. It just has to be an interactive process, a two-way, I guess you can say a two-way exchange between the employer and the employee about what reasonable accommodations the employer is willing to offer and what the employee is willing to accept. Okay, like what would it be? Like tell us, what would it be? So it depends on the facts. It's very fact dependent. What would be a reasonable accommodation under one circumstance may not be a reasonable accommodation in another circumstance. It depends on what the employer does, what the employee does, what their job is, and so forth and so on. But one of them could be something like the employee agrees to testing every week or every 2 weeks or at an interval instead of taking the vaccine. That's one. Or the employee, if they can, the employee agrees to work from home or something. So what is a reasonable accommodation? It depends on what the employee does, depends on the circumstance of the work. Okay. The most important thing is that they have to engage in an interactive process. Oh, and I would say that if the employer takes your application and does not engage in any process with you, and they're
they agree to give you an accommodation, but that accommodation is unpaid leave, that is usually not considered a reasonable accommodation. And I should say, after having said that, nothing that I have said right now creates an attorney-client relationship between me or any of the audience members. But that's just an example of what doesn't work. What does work depends on the circumstances.
Okay, now, just last week, Supreme Court comes down with a couple of rulings. Okay, first one is you can't force anybody to be vaccinated, the mandate, okay? And I think that was like, 6-3 or something like that. And then the second part of it was, but what about for healthcare workers? And the court says 5-4, well, it doesn't apply to them. They have to obey the mandate because it comes under OSHA, one of those deals, some administrative agency who's made rules before for Medicaid and Medicare. I mean, does religious exemption apply to the healthcare workers too? How do you deal with this?
Well, so you're asking right now specifically about the CMS mandate, or the so-called CMS mandate. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and just provide us context. So the Biden administration has issued 5 vaccine mandates. 2 of them were at issue before the U.S. Supreme Court last week. One is called the OSHA Emergency Temporary Standard, which says that employers with at least 100 employees have to ensure that their employees are either fully vaccinated for COVID or they engage in weekly testing. So it's a mandate to test or to vaccinate. That one impacts about 84 million workers across the country. Then the second one is the one you asked about, which was the CMS mandate, or I think it should be better known as the CMMS mandate because it's from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And that rule from the federal government says that all healthcare facilities that receive federal funding must have all of their employees vaccinated unless their employees qualify for a religious or medical exemption or accommodation. So there is a religious accommodation built into the rule itself. That rule implicates approximately 10 million healthcare workers across the country. And by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court decided not to enjoin it. So I'm going to backtrack again a little bit. What was at issue before the Supreme Court regarding these 2 mandates, the court did not say that these mandates are unconstitutional. It did not rule on the merits. There are legal challenges against both of these mandates. And the question before the Supreme Court was, do we enjoin the enforcement of these mandates while the legal challenges to them are pending in the lower federal courts? So the court said for the OSHA mandate, which was the bigger one, it said it cannot be enforced while the legal challenge to it is pending in the lower federal courts. It said it declined to enjoin the CMS mandate. So the CMS mandate can be enforced while the legal challenge to it is pending in the lower federal courts.
Okay, talk about the lower court. How would it affect, for instance, Florida has been very, very good regarding religious exemptions. How does the recent ruling or what's happening in the lower courts impact upon the healthcare workers right here, say, in the great state of Florida?
Well, right now, I do not believe that there are any challenges. I don't believe that any of the legal challenges to the CMS mandate have come out of Florida. I believe that they are before the 8th Circuit. I'm correct. I don't believe any of them have come out of Florida yet. So right now, whichever it's before a U.S. Court of Appeals right now, whichever appellate court it's before, that appellate court will have to decide whether they'll have to decide on the merits. It'll have to decide whether the CMS mandate is constitutional or not. And then once that court rules, inevitably it will go up to the Supreme Court to decide on the merits, which could take months.
Okay. Does your organization...
Now, if there is an injunction, if a lower federal court issues an injunction against the CMS mandate, how will that impact Florida? Well, first of all, it depends on where that federal court is. If the federal court is, say, in Texas, then the federal court will most likely grant an injunction that applies only to its territorial jurisdiction or only to the parties that are before it. But in some circumstances, a federal court in one part of the country can issue a nationwide injunction or a nationwide injunction against the mandate. It depends on the circumstances. Now, when it comes to the merits, when a court finally gets to the merits of the case, then the court's ruling is limited only to its territorial jurisdiction.
Okay.
So if, let's say, the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri determines that the CMS mandate violates the Constitution and enjoins its enforcement, it's probably going that ruling is going to be it's going to be limited most likely to the territorial jurisdiction of that court.
Okay, well, Alexander, we're running out of time, and I'm so fascinated by the breadth of knowledge that you have regarding religious freedom. As I said, I have sent people to you over the last year or so. When somebody has a problem with religious freedom and they contact you, is there any cost involved?
$1.
Oh,
So
holy, you hear that? $1. This guy is fantastic. Look, please, if you do have a problem needing a exemption for religious freedom, like Alexander said, deeply held religious beliefs, not that I'm just afraid of getting an injection, you call up the Pacific Justice Institute, and Alexander is going to help you out. Hey, look, ladies and gentlemen, Alexander's for action, I'm for action, and I hope you are too. We would like to thank our generous sponsors for their wonderful support. Thanks for watching. Please join us next time for Action for Life. I'm for action, and I hope you are too. I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, the big G, and the little g, all the good things that people are doing to put the gospel of life into action. So please join us for the next episode of Action for Life.